Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a project update video for this 1/6 scale Armortek radio-controlled early production German Tiger 1. Since the last video, the tank's front top deck area has been basically completed, and we'll be going over all of these modifications and additions in this video. It's a lot of material to go over, so stay tuned. One of the bits of machinery that need to be addressed at this time of the build is the turret rotation gearbox motor. Now, the system that we have here is the current system which is utilized by the Armortek kits, and by and large it's very similar in the way it works compared to the older generations made by Armortek. This has to do with the geared motor, the gear, and the motor mount. What's different on the newer generation has to do with the little speed controller unit that we have here. In the past, the speed controller was actually integrally built into the option packs and was self-contained. Recently, they went ahead and swapped it out for this Viper electronic speed control system, and this is the unit that is stock with the Armortek kit. The unit comes pre-configured, so that's basically ready for plug-and-play installation out of the box. Same can also be said about the geared motor. The little rotation gear that we have here is made from brass and steel, and the motor mount itself is made from CNC'd aluminum alloy. Now, basically all of the installation and assembly at this point here will be primarily stock. First and foremost, I will go ahead and take the motor mount and get it into a coat of primer, which is something that I typically do, of course, on these builds. From there, the motor and the gear will be mounted to this unit. Okay, now here's the motor fully assembled and ready for installation. The unit here was built again totally out of box, but the only addition was the use of red Loctite on these fasteners over here. Now, like I frequently mention in these videos, this is one portion where you specifically don't want to have any sort of wiggle whatsoever. The red Loctite is absolutely crucial in keeping everything firmly in place once everything is torqued down. Now, when it comes time for mounting it, that's some of these two fastener locations that we have over here. Now, if you try to simply just mount the unit as is, you're going to notice that it's not going to be able to be installed due to the way the bearing ring is designed on this portion of the kit. Now, Armortek actually addresses this, and they supply you with the kit this little bag here, which has this little adapter plate and the fasteners for the installation. The adapter plate acts as a spacer and simply just drops in and is sandwiched in between the motor mount and the top deck. Once fitted, you will then have the appropriate clearance. Now, when it comes time for mounting on the gear, you want to have it mounted as close as possible to the bottom portion of the mount. This will give you a little bit of leeway here on the top, which will give you just the right amount of clearance required to clear this ring that we have here. Now, once the component is installed, you're going to have a very thin space between the top of the gear and the top portion here of the bearing ring. This is absolutely required because you do not want to have these two components making contact with each other in any way, shape, or form. The clearance is less than a 1/16 of an inch, or even a little bit less than probably 1 millimeter, but it is sufficient enough to prevent these two pieces from making contact and marring. Once the gear ring and this component are mounted firmly to the top deck, you'll see exactly the tolerances that I'm referring to. Now, in addition to the turret rotation gearbox being fitted, I also need to mount on the actual turret rotation gear. Now, this is where the design of the tank is different compared to past iterations of the Armortek Tiger 1. In the past, the turret ring that we have here would be mounted to the bottom portion of the turret. However, Armortek redesigned the kit to have the configuration that we have here. With this configuration, the turret rotation gear is firmly and permanently attached to the tank's top deck. Now, to do this, like I already mentioned in the last video, the ball bearing gear, and now to complete it, there are two more pieces that need to be affixed. The first is just what appears to be a water or laser cut aluminum ring that acts as a spacer. The ring is about 1/4 of an inch in thickness, and there are actually 2 of them that come with the set. This one here goes on the bottom, and then there's going to be another one which is going to be used as a spacer on the top portion of the tank. I'll be going over into that in a later video when I actually go into the turret assembly. From the spacer ring, this now takes us to the main tooth gear. The gear tooth that we have here is very similar, if not identical, to the ones found on previous iterations of the Armortek kit. It's made from laser cut steel, and it is all pre-perforated and ready to go out of box. What's very nice about these turret turner systems is that they are very nicely machined, or I should say nicely cut, and there's not any burrs or any other type of refining that needs to be done to these pieces. You could just mount them as is. Now, before I go ahead and mount this to the vehicle, this ring here, because it is steel, is going to be getting a coat of primer, just to keep it protected from any sort of surface rust that can develop over time. Now, when it comes time for the mounting, there are going to be several very long fasteners that are going to be secured to this portion here of the top ring. The reason for this has to do with, again, the way the turret is designed on this particular rendition of the Tiger. It's actually firmly attached to the top deck. More info on that is to come, but however, why this is important for this build here is that it's at this point where I can go ahead and mount this component on, followed by the turret rotation gearbox. Now, because of the modifications that I mentioned in the last video, in regards to these fasteners, if we recall, on the last video, I utilized slightly longer fasteners to secure the ball bearing ring to the top deck. Because of this modification, mounting on the ring in its stock configuration is not going to be successful because of the longer portion of the fasteners that descend from the bottom portion of the ring. They're going to lock the turret ring in place, and obviously this is definitely something that needs to be addressed. Now, to fix this, I will be removing the top sections of these threaded bolts that we have here with a Dremel with a cutting stone, and luckily the portion that needs to be removed is just the overhead threads which descend from the fastener. Because of these overhead threads, this is what's making contact with the ring, preventing it from rotating. These sections of the fasteners are totally ancillary and are not needed, so removing and deleting them serves no detriment whatsoever to the strength of the bolts. Once these are trimmed away, the ring can then be mounted directly in place as per the kit. And here's the ring now affixed to the top deck of the model. The fasteners went on with no problems, and the piece was a very smooth install, specifically once the fasteners were shortened that I mentioned before. And here you can see the fasteners that have been shortened and their clearance now with the tooth ring. Obviously, with this type of clearance, there's going to be no chance of any sort of inhibiting of the ring making contact with the mounting fastener. Now, one minor change that I made to the assembly has to do with the fastener types. If you notice, rather than utilizing the stock cap type Allen fasteners, I replaced those with these Phillips ones. The reason for that has to do with these Phillips fasteners here are lower profile and have less of a chance of snagging any type of equipment that's found on the inside of the vehicle. The length of the fastener, however, is the exact same length as the ones found on the stock Armortek kit. So it was just a direct swap out replacement. Now, on the top deck, here we can see how the external portion of the ring looks. Mounted onto this section here is the lift washer ring that I mentioned before. This needs to be mounted at this point here of the build in order to fasten the bolts that you see here. Now, this is as per the Armortek kit, and from this point here, the turret bottom section can actually drop directly onto these sections over here. Now, one slight change that I made to the set is the addition of a spring washer that we have underneath the fastener here. The purpose for that has to do with, again, when it comes time for the turret will utilize these fasteners here to mount onto. However, the fasteners that are going to hold the turret on are going to be removable in case you ever need to remove the turret off of the top deck. Because of this, the fasteners cannot have any sort of play or wiggle or movement to them whatsoever. The fastener is held on with this nut over here. This is held on with red Loctite, and the spring washer really helps keep everything torqued down, and once everything is solid and sealed up, will prevent it from loosening when it comes time for threading, loosening, and tightening of the bolts used on the turret bottom half mounting fasteners. Now, it's at this point here where I can actually rotate the turret in a very smooth manner. Once the gearbox gets fitted, this is no longer going to be the case, and the gearbox will be the only thing that will be able to rotate the turret either left or right. Now, before I do though, here you can see how smooth the turret ring will rotate. Now, I did have to add some drops of oil to the inside of the ball bearings in order to loosen them up and break them in. I presume after a few rotations and with a little bit more oil here and there, the ring will loosen up a lot more fluidly than the way you see it right here. It's definitely recommended for anyone who gets one of these type of generation of Armortek tanks to add the oil to one of these ball bearings. And here you can see it on the inside. And of course, once the tooth gear ring is added, it's then time to mount on the motor. Now, the motor went on to the model's top deck with 0 issues that were encountered, and all of the stock hardware was utilized with the exception of one. Now, where I deviated from the stock kit had to do with the nuts that we have here for the mounting hardware. Now, the actual bolts themselves are the kit supplied units and were used as is. What was changed are the actual nuts. Now, the model wants you to utilize just standard M4 hex nuts for the actual fastening of this part. This will work. However, one procedure that I like to do, or one change I should say that I like to do on my builds, is I replace the stock, just regular hex nut, and replace that with a nylock fastener. The nylock fastener gives you more strength and really holds everything firmly in place in a tighter manner compared to a standard hex nut. Also, you notice I went ahead and added a washer for good measure as well. Now, of course, Loctite was used to really keep everything firmly in place. Like what I was alluding to before, when it comes to this mounting here, you want to have absolutely 0 wiggle or play in it whatsoever. This piece really has to be mounted rock solid. I can't stress that enough. If there's any sort of play in this piece here, or if the fasteners get loose on you in any which way, the turret rotation system will fail and will not run nearly as good as it's supposed to be. The turret, specifically on a Tiger one like this, does have a considerable amount of weight to it, so the motor is going to be under a little bit of strain. Now, if there's any sort of play or wiggle, the piece is going to move out of the way before the inertia is broken and the turret will be able to rotate. So this piece here needs to be mounted on in a rock solid format. Now, fortunately, this is very easy to do, even again with the stock components. When done properly, the turret will give you absolutely flawless performance and will last for many years. And now that's fully assembled, you can see how the spacer is utilized to elevate the piece. Again, this was kit supplied and worked as advertised. Now, if you look carefully, you can see just how close the gear makes contact with the bearing ring. Or I should say the lack thereof making contact. This is exactly what you're looking for. The tolerances are very, very close, but are more than enough to prevent these two pieces from ever contacting each other, which of course can lead to issues. The way you see the motor here is exactly how the piece is designed and will work accordingly. From the turret ring, this now takes us to the detailing for the top deck. The number one detailing to start with are the main tow cable mounts. Now, the tow cable mounts are comprised of the drawings that we have here in the instruction and this little baggie here for the stave mounts. Now, the reason why I'm utilizing the drawing over here is to get a good idea on how the parts assemble. Basically, the components are comprised of CNC'd aluminum and laser cut steel that are then all fastened together. The units are very functional. They do a very good job in holding the tow cables in place and assemble very well and easily. However, they're not going to be used for this build. The reason for that has to do with the overall detailing and shape of the parts. They give you, again, the basic idea of how the parts look and represent. However, they can be improved from the stock original. The stave mounts that we have here are the ones that utilize the plate that hold them in place, and this is what's used to hold both the tow cables and the gun cleating staves in their locations on the side portion of the hull. If we notice, these are comprised of CNC aluminum bits, and there is a laser cut piece of steel strap that is used for the top mounting point. Now, before I was able to mount the stave and cable mounts to the vehicle, I noticed that the holes that are found into these sections here are slightly on the small side. To enlarge these holes, I am going to be utilizing the drill press. However, because these pieces are split with the type of machining that was done to them, you cannot just simply drill them out by putting the piece in the vise and just running the drill press through it. Instead, what I'm going to do is this technique over here. I took the two units from the kit and I bolted them together. Now, these pieces are pre-tapped, so to mount them together was not very difficult. I just took a fastener and just ran it through the pre-tapped threads. Once that is done, you now have a perfect rectangle over here, and at this point I can clamp this set here into my vise, and with the drill press I can go ahead and proceed with enlarging the holes. Now, for the drill bit diameter, I'm going to be utilizing 1/4 of an inch. The drill bit makes very short work of the material, and here you can see just how much larger these pieces are. And here are the units I'm going to be using in place of the stock Armortek sets. The units that we have here are the resin and metal ones that I offer on the EastCoastArmory.com catalog. They consist of two components. We have here the main tow cable lock, and then we have the smaller locks that are located on the rear portion of the vehicle. Now, because I will be keeping the stock tow cable and stave mounts, the resin ones which normally would come with these sets here, I'm going to omit for this build. These pieces here are comprised of, again, resin for the main base, and the top portions are fabricated from pieces of brass. If you notice on the main tow eye sections, these are actually hinged, and on the real tank here there would be a fastener coming up and a wing nut would secure everything in place. This is going to be added to this detailing. However, this is going to be done once the pieces are mounted to the vehicle, as the actual mounting fastener is going to thread directly into this section here and then protrude outward so that you can lock everything down with a fastener just like on the real unit. Now, for the secondary securing points, again, resin castings for the base, and the top portion here is again made from a small brass strip. Now, the design of the two smaller units are slightly different. Here we have the retention plate, I should say, that is going to be fastened to the vehicle via a hex bolt, and then on this side here is actually held in place with a small little wing nut. Now, the wing nuts detailing, of course, are going to be added, but this is something that's generally done at the very tail end of the build, just before the model's completion. Of course, I'll be going over that once I hit that point of the build. From the tow cables, this now brings us to the bow hatches. Now, the bow hatches that are supplied with the kit are comprised of basically the components that we have here. Starting from right to left, here we have these two hatch rings. These connect to the upper deck of the vehicle and give you the correct standoff that is found on the Tiger 1. On the Tiger 1, the hatches not just simply lay flat on the deck, instead are supported by a ring that we have here. These rings here are made from CNC'd aluminum and are very nicely done out of the box, and these will be used on this build. The other details we have here are the main hatches themselves. As one can clearly see, they look just like what you would expect for a Tiger 1. They have their correct shape and profile to them, including their little bevel. What is absent, however, on these hatches are any sort of interior detailing whatsoever. And from the hatches, this now brings us to the hinge work. Here we have the hinge sections, which are made again from CNC'd aluminum. Very nice quality pieces, nice and strong and durable. And we also have some hinge components. Now there are a few other pieces like the pressed sheet metal guards for the periscopes. However, it's not really important to point out because I'm not going to be utilizing these parts here that I just mentioned. The reason for that has to do with the basic detail nature of these hatches. Now these hatches will build you out of the box a very representable Tiger 1. However, for my builds, I like to go ahead and kick the detail up to the next step. So these hatches here will not be used. Instead, I'll be replacing them with an aftermarket source. And here are the hatches I'm going to be utilizing on this build. This set here is a white metal aftermarket set from Armorpacks.com. The link is in the video description, and Armorpacks, like I've mentioned before in several of my other builds, is a company that specializes in 1/6 scale tank aftermarket components. All of their components are generally made from white metal, but they do have some resin parts as well. I've used them on several occasions on my builds, and they are highly recommended. The quality on these pieces are no different. At a quick glance, you can already see just how much more elaborate and how much more detailed this set here is compared to the stock simplistic set found on the Armortek kit. Here we have the two main hatches. Here we have the exterior portion. You notice it does have its foundry casting marks on it. Now, even though these hatches are machined at the foundry, there are some texturing found on these components, and these are present on the Armorpacks pieces. What's also nice about the Armorpack set is they also have the interior detailing that we have here. Here we have molded in the little rubber gasket that is found on the real hatch, as well as also the other amenities that are present on the interior portion of these pieces. On this side here, we have all of the latch mechanisms, which of course will going to be fitted to this section over here. This would include the lever, the locking lugs, as well as even the guide sections. On this side here, we have the hinge work, and even the counterbalance spring detailing. Now these pieces here are just cast white metal. They do not actually function with the use of an actual return spring, but they do give you that nice added detailing. Something like this for this build is not necessarily important, but if you are building a Tiger 1 with a full interior detailing, this is a set that I strongly recommend. In addition to the spring work, here we have the hinges, and as we can see, it has the other little bit of detailing and stops that are missing on the other simplistic tooling found on the Armortek set. Now, unlike the Armortek one, which is actually stronger than this one here, this being white metal, the pieces are robust, but not nearly as robust as something made from solid CNC aluminum. So these hatches here are definitely not going to be able to take a whole lot of abuse. But for this type of detailing and for the application that these hatches are going to be used for, these hinges here should be more than suffice. Even on the interior portion, we have the little hatch stop and the little retention hook, which is a nice bit of detailing integrally molded in. And here we have the periscope cover that I just dropped on the floor. You can also see on the top portion of the hatch, there is a integral sculpted well bead detailing, integrally casted onto the piece, so it's one less bit of work that needs to be exhibited by the builder. Last but not least, we have here the periscopes. Now the periscopes are, again, all made in a solid white metal format. They do have all their little detailing represented, including the little springs. And the last of the pieces are all these small little wing nuts and other fasteners, which are used for the wing nuts which hold the two halves of the periscope in place, and the other fasteners are for the other little hinge mechanisms that are going to be affixed to the set. And here are the hatches now fully assembled and ready for their primer and paint and then final installation. Starting with the two rings on top, these were the kit supplied rings that I mentioned before, and here, now that they're no longer in the bag, you get to see exactly how these pieces are machined. Like I said before, these are excellently made and are going to be utilized out of box. These sets here, these rings are more common on the more recent renditions of the Armortek Tiger 1 and are not found on the first 2 or even 3 releases of the Tiger 1 kits once released. Now, one advantage about these is that I believe if you contact Armortek, you can actually purchase these rings yourself if your Tiger does not utilize this type of setup. Also, the rings will work with the aftermarket hatches that I have here. Now, moving to the hatches themselves, you can see that they've been totally assembled with the kit components. However, I went ahead and enhanced the kit further from the original Armor Pack set. Here we have the exterior version of the hatch. This was pretty much stock. However, what's going to be interesting is what was done on the interior. Here we have the hatch with all of its locking mechanism fully assembled. Now, one little feature that I built into this set was the ability to actually make the locking mechanism fully function. And you can see here how the piece pivots. Now, the reason for this has to do with the way the kit is designed. Honestly, it was easier to make the set functional as opposed to just gluing everything in place. This is a common trait found on a lot of the Armor Pack's components, where they are designed to be static with their assembly, but with not a whole lot of extra elbow grease, you can actually make the system fully functional, which is precisely what I've done here. The way this was done was the molded in components for the center stems of these sections over here were deleted, and I just drilled them out. I also drilled out a center portion on the hatch and drilled a countersink section so that I can house in a fastener just like these brass ones that I have here. The fastener is then secured in place with a nut as well as a little plastic washer that I fabricated, and once this is bolted in place, this then allows the center portions and the lugs to rotate freely. It was a very simple procedure, however, it is one that needs to be done with a lot of care, patience, and expertise, as you can easily over-drill some of these components and possibly screw it up. In fact, that did happen to one of these hatches here. However, I was able to correct the damage that was made, and honestly, I can't even tell which one was the one that was damaged. On the exterior portion, you'll notice I went ahead and plugged up the fastener, because on the real Tiger 1, there would be no exposed fastener on this hatch here. The putty that remains plugs up the hole and also blends the cast texture in with the rest of the hatch itself. Now, for the remainder of the hatch, you'll notice that I went ahead and added 3 more fasteners on the exterior portion here. This does twofold. First, this is present on the real Tiger 1, and on the real Tiger 1 there are 3 very flush mounted fasteners that are found in this location because they hold on the hinge. On this model here, they do the exact same purpose in addition to giving the detail work. Now, the kit did have these sections here molded in, and everything just is meant to be glued together. However, with the weight of these hatches, and also with the proclivity being used a lot to open and close to get access to the switch and all, I deem that the just adhesives alone is going to be problematic and is something that could lead to breakage down the road. So to cut it off at the pass, I went ahead and just drilled out the locations for the molded in fasteners and replaced them with the real ones. This was simply done because I first glued the hinge in place. Once the adhesive set, this gives me the locations of the holes, and I just drilled it out on the drill press, countersunk or counterbored the holes on the opposite side, and bolted away. Now for the hinge work, this is left stock, and I went ahead and enlarged the holes here because these are going to mate with the slightly larger fasteners that are used on the kit top deck that I'll go over in a second. The one bit of detailing that was omitted are the large fake springs that go on either side. The springs look very good for interior detailing, however, for a model like this, they're just not necessary, and if anything, you're going to get into the way and just eventually lead to breakage. So rather than employing this extra bit of detailing, which again is unnecessary, I just simply omitted it from this build that I'm doing here. Now, moving on from the hatches takes us to the periscopes. The periscopes themselves are stock again. And you can see I added the wing nut detailing, which is supplied with the Armortek kit. From this point here, they will be painted, and then these are going to be mounted to the hatches towards the end of the build once all the painting and weathering is concluded. Now, I'm more than likely going to add small little pins to these sections over here and corresponding pin holes found on the hatch, just so it has more structure in holding it up, because just, again, relying on adhesives alone to keep everything secured is probably less than ideal, specifically with the weight of these periscopes. With gravity always pulling down on them, not to mention the shock of opening and closing, this can possibly lead to these pieces popping off, which is, again, less than ideal. Another bit of upper hull detailing that I'm getting done at this point is the front center blower. Now, this part that we have here is the one that's supplied with the stock Armortek kit, and this component here has relatively stayed exactly unchanged since the Tiger ones were originally offered back in 2002. It's comprised of a single turning of CNC aluminum and has a large nub on the bottom to plug into the top deck. Now, rather than utilizing the kit one, I'm going to be swapping it out for one of my own resin castings. Now, this set here is not found on the ECA product line. This was just a unit that I casted for my own personal builds. The piece is different in shape, but has a more of a conical shape to the top and more of a taper to the sides. Compare that to the stock Armortek unit, you can see that the basic unit will give you, again, the idea of the front blower, but is going to be just swapped out with the ECA resin one. All this guy needs is to be squared off on the belt sander, and then I could just drop him onto the top deck. Now, in a really quick tutorial on how to line up the new replacement air blower onto the hull in the exact location where the original would have went, well, it's very simple. Since the original one does have a tongue and peg type assembly, I just line up the assembly in its correct place, trace the line with a pencil. Once the tracing is done, it now gives me the exact location where the air blower needs to be, and the stock one can go ahead and end up in the bin of misfit parts, while I could then mount the replacement unit in the exact same location and in place. From the hatches, this now brings us back to the tank's top deck. Now, at this point here, it doesn't exactly look like a whole lot, but it is at this point where I can now progress and add on the remainder of the surface detailing, which would include, of course, the bow hatches, the tool posts, as well as even the welds. Now, even at this point here, there are some other fittings that have been mounted to the top deck, which we'll be going over right now. Now, at quick glance, you can see all the bodywork that is being made to the front section here of the vehicle. The purpose of the bodywork is to delete all of the kit supplied holes, which were originally intended for mounting of the stock tools, as well as even the stock mounting systems that I mentioned in the last video. As a quick recap, the model's top deck is designed to mount to the stock kit via countersunk fasteners, which would have been strewn along the edges here of the top deck. Because I went ahead and changed that system to the magnet lock system, these countersunk holes are no longer necessary and need to be deleted. These were plugged up with my usual bodywork tactics, which requires a two-part epoxy, which fulfills most of the main filling need, and then for a surface coat, some red glazing putty is applied, and then a few layers later it gets sanded down nice and smooth. From this point here, the surface is perfectly smooth, and all visual cues of the original holes are no longer going to be present once the entire top goes into its primer as well as its base. Now, the tool posts are going to be added in its place, and I'm going to be utilizing aftermarket tools and tool posts, which is why the use of the original kit mounts is no longer needed, thus get completely erased. Once the bodywork was wrapped up, I went ahead and mounted on the hatch rings that I showcased earlier. These simply drop directly onto the kit and are only held in place with some adhesives. Once these components are mounted, however, there's no chances of them ever getting loose or popping off on you during operation. Moving from the hatch rims takes us to the tow cable locks. Now, the tow cable locks have been mounted into place and are permanently fixed to the model. Now, these are the same resin units that were mentioned before. However, to mount them to the vehicle, these sections here are actually tapped. And because they are tapped, the fastener runs through the bottom of the upper plate and threads directly into this component. This does two things. First, this gives you the added strength of having a steel core section, which keeps the component firmly mounted where it needs to be. This is specifically important due to the size and thickness of the steel cables that are supplied with the kit. If you just have the piece glued onto the top deck alone, that's not going to be enough to keep the thing in place, and it's going to eventually crack on you during operation, which of course is less than ideal. By having the piece threaded on, this firmly keeps the component firmly in place, and it also gives you the strength required for the tow cable. Now, if you notice, the threading is actually longer than the lid itself. This is of course going to be adjusted shortly after the filming of this take. It's going to be long enough so that it has enough strength and so that a locking nut can keep everything bolted in place, but it's going to be short enough so that the strap can just slide directly into its proper location for clamping purposes. Now, the units here had to have been moved slightly from the stock original unit. With the way the kit original counterpart was designed, the piece would have been too close to the middle section, and this would have caused some slagging issues with the tow cable. Because of that, I had to go ahead and slightly modify the top deck with drilling a new hole in its current location, which is compatible with these two units. The way this is done is I put the top deck onto the model, I take the tow cable, run it across its paces, and then where the component needs to be is where I mark it, drill it, and then mount it. Now, in addition to the fastener, adhesives were also utilized to keep these guys firmly in place, and what's going to be added shortly again after the filming of this take is some sculpted weld beads in these sections over here, which gives it a little bit extra strength, but really primarily it's for detail accuracy. From the front tow cable locks takes us to the middle stave sections. These, of course, are the kit ones that were slightly tweaked and at this point have been mounted permanently to the model. Now, just like with the two eyelets in the front, these sections here are threaded in order to facilitate the securement of the fastener. Now, unlike the other resin components where I had to tap those sections, on the Armortek kit, these are already pre-tapped for you, which saves a little bit of time. However, one thing to point out is that on the Armortek kit, this version here on the end and this little hole here is where it's used to secure the unit in place. This secondary screw here is completely ancillary and is not really necessary in order to keep everything bolted down. In its place, I just went ahead and marked and drilled a new hole for the second fastener, and that's the location which is used to secure and clamp this unit to the top deck of the model. From here, just a simple steel plate will be mounted over with the locking fasteners, and that's going to keep both the staves and the tow cables in place and prevent them from moving around. Of course, like with the units on the front, sculpted weld beads are going to be added to these two sections as well.